One thing that really concerns me about the 2012 election is the very basic idea that we as Americans don't really know each other. We are given the responsibility as citizens to look after each other. I say this because we are in a democracy, and so we are charged with working together as opposed to in opposition of one another. And I look at our political rhetoric, and it's obviously very polarized. I asked a group of students once, where would they hear opposing views? Just views that oppose their own. I'd given them a lecture about a media landscape in one city, and I used Montgomery, Alabama, and I used the example of the two stations where you can hear NPR, syndicated NPR programming. One is the jazz program, one is the jazz channel, and the other is the classical channel. And I didn't tell the students that the jazz channel and the classical channel were these two channels, but I told them about the kinds of views that were there. And then I said, well, one is on the jazz channel, one is on the classical music channel. And I said European classical. And immediately they understood that, these conservative views are one way, and, the sort of free market will save us and everyone pick themselves up by their bootstraps is there. But on the other side, the idea that we would even work together, that we would have a community. And that does not mean socialist per se, but it actually does mean pooling certain kinds of resources. Like pooling resources that get us roads, air, water. But I think we would extend that list. And when I listen to Tea Party members, and this is one, the Tea Party and the 99% movement or Occupy movement are a clear example, I think, to a lot of people of how our divisive, polarized news rhetoric really hurts us, because if you look at what they're saying, they're not saying anything terribly different. But the tactics might be different, and the groups of people may never even come in the same space. The so-called liberals and the Occupy movement versus the so-called conservatives. But like I said, they're saying the same things. But where would they get in the same room? And in the political news, where would they even have the same conversation? Because I have been in here in America for about 2 or 3 weeks now. What I've noticed is that I can look at MSNBC, I can look at CNN, I can look at Fox, and I can hear 3 different ideas about who we are as a nation state. And yet to see where they cross, to see where they meet is very difficult. And what's even worse, there's a new study, I think it was the Pew Research Center, that showed that we get less and less video, like what I'm doing right now, that even though we have more capability of doing that, and we get more of the celebrity journalist commentary. I love Rachel Maddow, I love Al Sharpton, I love all these people on MSNBC and CNN, blah blah blah, and I don't mind the label liberal, even though I know it's dirty. But at the same time, I look at the news programs, just like many others on Fox, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. The news was like 10 seconds, and then the commentary was like 45 minutes. And so again, I say, well, and they comment on, MSNBC comments on what Fox News presenters say, and probably vice versa. But when do they actually meet and have a conversation? And that's the part that I think most Americans are really missing, because we tend to assume that everyone's just like us. We tend to assume that everyone thinks like us, works like, has the similar kind of values. And so we're not even good with confronting difference, to be real. And that's that's where this video comes full circle, is how do we as Americans confront difference and govern when we are so steeped in the idea of, assimilation. We haven't really let go of that everyone is just like us. And so whenever the newcomer, the new immigrant population comes to America, they're niggers. You have the Irish niggers, the Scottish niggers. Now we have you have the Arab niggers. I'm here in Alabama. You have the Latin niggers. And of course, here in Alabama and Georgia, you have the niggers. And yet all these different groups, where there is common ground. The common ground is work ethic. And I think that that's really the heart of where we're going with this Occupy movement, the Tea Party movement, is that we are a nation of single values voters. I believe in abortion, so I'm going to vote for Bush, even though he's waging a war. I don't agree with that. But, God said, and God hates fags. And, so you have a lot of people voting against, working people voting against their own interests. And so you begin to ask yourself, how can this be remedied? Like, where can we actually have conversations? Where can we actually have dialogue? Again, you know, look at the comments on many of my videos. People immediately start out with, you know, barrage of hate. You said this and you're this and dismissiveness and belittling each other. And I'm thinking, this is not dialogue. Like, we can disagree, but why do we have to vehemently disagree? Or why do we have to insult each other just to disagree? It's those kind of things that become normal in such a climate, and that because of that, we will always work against each other. Our politics, just like our political rhetoric, will always be about this group versus that group. There'll never be any coalition building. So, you know, I'm from Kentucky, and I'm now in Alabama, and, you know, I say to my senators, and particularly these two states, if your goal is making sure that our president is a one-term president, how do you demonstrate to me as a citizen that you respect the office of the presidency, no matter who is there, because we put him there? And B, how do you respect the political process? Because you obviously don't, if you're that disrespectful to the president. But regardless of what you feel about that, here's a fundamental question. Who's governing? Who's governing while they're playing politics? Who's governing while, you know, who's taking care of us? Like I said, the public goods, the schools, the roads, the air, the water, you know, the children. Who's taking care of all of that while we're playing politics? We can't even have a discussion about it.